Hello and welcome to GameSack. A viewer suggested a topic which I think is pretty cool, and that's to take a look at games which are better on weaker hardware. So, for example, a game gets released on both 8 and 16-bit platforms, but it happens to be that the 8-bit one is the better game. Now, sometimes the gameplay isn't identical, so it could be cheating a little in some cases, but that's okay. This is all just for fun. Anyway, let's get started. Let's start out with Batman from Sunsoft on the PC Engine. This has been on GameSack a few times, and most of you probably know that it was only released in Japan. For good reason too, there's just not a good Batman game here. Basically, you spend the game wandering around with an overhead view. In some stages, you pick up trash. In other stages, you clean up graffiti. In others, you set time bombs. That sounds cool, but setting a time bomb uses the same exact gameplay as picking up trash. You just need to wander to a spot, Batman does his thing, and you move on. You can stun enemies and then get rid of them for several seconds by touching them. You can get power-ups to walk faster, shoot more batarangs, shoot them faster, and stuff like that. This helps because you're frozen in place when you shoot. The graphics are okay. The console can definitely do a lot better than this. The music is fantastic though. In the end, it's a decent game honestly, with tons of levels, but it's not what people expected when they bought a Batman game. It's especially perplexing since it was originally planned to be a side-scrolling adventure. Not sure why they changed it. Sunsoft also released Batman on the NES earlier that same year. This is a side-scrolling action platformer and a far better game. Instead of picking up trash and avoiding enemies, you attack them directly and kill them, which is what Batman is famous for. Wait, no, that's the Punisher. Oh well, he kills them in this game anyway. You have multiple weapons you can select from with the start button, but each one is limited in use. They all share the same inventory stock, but certain weapons use up more because they're stronger. If you die, you start over with the same amount remaining, which can be a detriment if you get sloppy. Batman also has a super fun wall jump, and you need to use this strategically to get past each stage. Some stages require incredible precision with this move. The game can be quite frustrating the first few times that you play. I've always sucked at this game, as you can tell by my gameplay here. But if you put enough time into it, even you can make it to the part where you fight the Super Shredder. That is Super Shredder, right? The graphics are dark and grainy, but certainly way more pleasing than another game I'll talk about later in this episode, which also features dark and grainy graphics. In fact, the graphics here are quite good for the console. Even better is the music. Sunsoft did no wrong on the NES when it came to music, at least in their main releases. I'm pretty sure that this was originally a different game that they were working on before Sunsoft got the license, and then they did their best to put some Batman into it. I mean, it's not much like the movie outside of the cutscenes. Oh, and the end boss here, I guess. Ouch. Perhaps that's the story of the PC Engine version of Batman as well. I think the only Batman game based on the 1989 movie that Sunsoft designed from the ground up as a Batman game was the excellent Genesis version, which I personally like a little bit more than the NES game. But a lot of people like the 8-bit one the most, and that's perfectly fine. Oh, and although this one's not the focus of this video, the version of Batman for the Game Boy is also better than the PC Engine game. Batman shoots guns here, once again just like the Punisher. But hey, it's still action and less something like Pac-Man. One thing's for sure though, both of the Batman games based on the 1989 movie for the Nintendo systems are much better than the Sunsoft Batman game for the far more powerful PC Engine. This is Virtua Racing on the Saturn, courtesy of Time Warner Interactive. This is a polygonal 3D racing game based on F1 or maybe Indy, but yeah, probably F1. The main gimmick of this game back at the time of its release was the ability to switch between any one of 4 viewpoints on the fly using the amazing 3D technology. Here, you get the 3 tracks from the arcade to race on. They're represented okay here, but sadly it seems to underperform given the Saturn hardware. I'd expect the Saturn to be able to manage a much faster frame rate than this, but you know how stingy Sega was with developers who weren't Sega at the time. Sega also gave Time Warner a Virtua Racing arcade cabinet and they had to eyeball it when converting it to the Saturn, so that probably didn't help either. No source code for these guys. The control is fine, but the game feels like it slows down a lot. I can feel it struggling sometimes. The physics also feel a bit different from pretty much any other version of this game. It does have some extra stuff, like more tracks and cars, but to race these you need to play the championship mode where you start out on go-karts. Still, the extra content is definitely welcome. There are some bugs in this one as well, like how it often forgets to play music during the replays. Yes, I'm using a real Saturn spinning the actual retail Virtua Racing disc here. Or how about when the game forgets to shut off the engine noise? Oh, that sounds good. Overall, they tried, and this is a good game on its own, but I feel that there's a better one that came before it. If you want a more faithful version of the game, play Virtua Racing Deluxe on the 32X. This was a launch game for the add-on, which makes it even more impressive. As you can see, it's basically the same game. Except here, it's much faster, and the controls are always very responsive. Only a couple of seconds until the race starts and we've got the wrong tires on! Quick guys, change them! As a game, you'll do just as poorly, but I always just play to have fun. I rarely ever win. You have 2 new cars and 2 new courses exclusive to this version, and you can select them right from the get-go. I honestly think that the colors look a lot better in this version compared to the Saturn game. The draw distance here is a little worse than the Saturn, but really not by much. The same goes with the frame rate. Here, the replay has awesome music that was made just for this version of the game. What's more is that the music here is in stereo. The Saturn version has CD quality music, but the entire game is in mono. The music on the disc itself is in stereo, they just screwed up when programming the game. And there's no way to adjust this in the options screen. There are actually a few different Saturn games that have the same issue. I'm guessing it had something to do with the software development kits that they were provided. There's also a PlayStation 2 version of Virtua Racing. I used to like this one a lot more than I do, but people pointed out how your car spins on its center axis and now it's just like something I can't overlook anymore. Don't get me wrong, it's still a fun game, but I like the 32X game more. In fact, I'd say that the 32X was the best way to play Virtua Racing outside of the arcade until it came out for the Switch in 2019. I wish it had the extra cars and tracks from the 32X game, but at least they took the cool replay theme from it. You might be wondering where Virtua Racing on the Genesis fits in here. Well, the feel of the game is certainly more faithful, but I could never get over the ugly dithered graphics in this one. Even when I gamed in composite video back in the 90s, the dithering in this particular title always bothered me. I never found that composite video blends dithering like people on the internet claim it does. But hey, at least this one's in stereo. Anyway, if you want to play Virtua Racing on a home console that's not the Nintendo Switch, I'd personally have to recommend the 32X game here. Okay, this next one might be a bit controversial because it's absolutely a subjective take. Well, actually, now that I think about it, everything on this show is subjective. Anyway, take a look. This is Lunar, Silver Star Story Complete for the PlayStation, published by Working Designs. This is an excellent 2D JRPG with a nice story. Some people call these games Lunar, and it's fine if you say it that way. It's also fine if you say it like a normal person. The characters themselves tend to pronounce it as Lunar though, so that's probably more correct in this case. In this game, you play as Alex, who builds a party on his quest to become a Dragon Master. Shenanigans ensue, and eventually you have to save the world, and that sweet, sweet Dragon Masterness is yours for the taking. The graphics and gameplay are both excellent. This is the kind of 2D greatness that I loved seeing in the 32-bit generation. The music is quite good as well. If this is your first foray into the Lunar games, there's really nothing much to complain about, and you'll have a great time for sure. But Lunar the Silver Star was originally released on the Sega CD, and I feel that this version is better in a few ways. Now, this might just be that I played it here first. I've gone back and forth on which version I like more, but having thought about it a lot, the Sega CD game comes out on top more often than not. They made some story changes for the remake that felt a bit odd. An example here is Luna leaving your sorry ass behind when you get on a boat in Saith.
Goodbye, my love.
Whereas in the PlayStation game, she goes with you.
I hope I did the right thing.
It kind of changes the dynamic a bit. But if you've never played the Sega CD version, you'd never know, so it's not going to bother you one bit. The gameplay here is just much better on the Sega CD. The battles are random here as opposed to the complete version, but that doesn't mean it's worse. I find the battles in the Sega CD game to be much faster and less annoying. Here, there's no loading. You get in and out of a battle with much less fuss. In the remake, the battles have to load. When a battle triggers in the PlayStation game, it kind of feels like you see your boss approaching down the hall bringing you a lot more extremely boring work to do. Let's just get this over with. Not only that, but the AI in the battle system is a lot worse in the remake, using up all of your magic on basic enemies for no reason. However, there are some tactics that you can use so you don't have to set each command for every party member every single time. It also takes longer to level up in the remake due to the slower battles and fewer experience points given. The whole game seems faster on the Sega CD, like it respects my time more as a human being. Maybe the worst sin about the remake in my opinion is that they completely recomposed the music. The Sega CD tunes are classic. Now, the new music is still great stuff, but it's not as good as the original, and it feels like it belongs in a different game. I would have loved to hear new arranged interpretations of the classic tunes in the remake. It's hard to overlook the amazing graphics and a few of the other quality of life improvements in the PlayStation remake, but if you've never played a Lunar game before and you want the best experience, I've got to recommend that you start with the Sega CD game. But I want to know, if you played the PlayStation version first, do you like it more than the Sega CD game? Maybe it all just depends on which one you experience first. Here's Batman Returns on the Genesis, released in 1992 and developed by Malibu Interactive. This was an important licensed title for Sega of America. It's an action platformer where you play as Batman, but you'd never know it. That's because Batman is woefully underpowered in this game. His hitbox is giant and his reach is short. He takes damage very easily and his life depletes quickly. He does have a utility belt to throw projectiles, but these are limited in supply. If you run out, you have absolutely no choice but to take hits from some enemies. The gameplay feels very stiff and disjointed, which is not helped at all by the poor level design. You have to hold up on the D-pad for what feels like a second before you can use your grappling hook. The graphics have some good ideas in the visual design, but come off as dark and extremely grainy. It's not pleasant looking at all. The music actually has some potential, but unfortunately the sound quality of the GEMS sound driver brings it way down. Hell, a lot of the music doesn't even play correctly on a Model 1 Genesis because they didn't bother to test the game with anything but a Model 2 console. Sunsoft's Batman for the Genesis, which was released a few years earlier, is a much better game at half the memory. Batman is far more nimble, especially with his grappling hook and his jumping. Of course, the music blows the stuff in Batman Returns away. I'm sure the developers of Batman Returns here saw it, but somehow deluded themselves into thinking that the game they were working on was somehow better. I wonder how they felt when they saw Konami's excellent Batman Returns on the Super NES. This game absolutely thrashes the Genesis game to an honestly embarrassing degree. Somehow, Sega of America probably still thought that their game was better because they'd go on to make more games of the same low quality. Sega spent money to have the developers go to the movie set to watch some of the scenes be filmed. I think the money could have been better spent on gameplay design, but it probably wouldn't have made any difference, honestly. Overall, the game is pretty dreadful to play. But did you know that Sega actually did make a fantastic Batman Returns game on the Game Gear? This is another side-scrolling action platformer, but in this one you might actually find yourself having fun. As Batman, you attack with an unlimited supply of batarangs that behave with a boomerang behavior. But you have 3 different strengths of these that you can adjust in the pause menu. You can have them travel further, but of course then your attack is a bit weaker. And of course, the strong attack is super short. In addition to this, you can call in the Batmobile for a special attack as long as you have some stock remaining. In each stage, you start by choosing your route. Which do you choose, your route or your route? Both will be the same stage, but with different layouts. Route 2 is usually a bit tougher than Route 1. You can use your grappling hook to ascend to certain platforms. You can also use it to maneuver yourself over bottomless chasms. Naturally, you have a life bar. There are bat icons scattered throughout each stage which will offer some life refills or allow you to use the Batmobile's special attack an additional time. Naturally, each stage ends in a boss fight and you'll need to learn their patterns. The graphics are pretty good for the handheld and the stage design really makes the game fun. The sound was done by Motohiro Kawashima, who works with Yuzo Koshiro a lot, and that means the music here is actually quite good. Batman Returns also showed up in Europe, Australia, and Brazil on the Master System. It's based on the same game, but this version is sadly worse and features reduced colors. They took away the life bar and now you die in one hit. You don't have a menu to select different ranges of attack. And somehow they managed to make the control feel worse, especially the grappling hook. So stick with the Game Gear version here if you want to have a fun side-scrolling Batman Returns game on a Sega platform. I was rather disappointed with this next game when it came out because I had hoped it would be better than the 8-bit versions which preceded it. But no. Here's Double Dragon on the mighty 16-bit Sega Genesis. This port from Accolade, or Ballistic, attempts to recreate the arcade faithfully. Honestly, the graphics are a little better and more colorful than the arcade. It looks great. Also, the arcade game was plagued with slowdown, and this version doesn't have any of that. In fact, it seems to run at warp speed. It also lets up to 2 players play simultaneously. Unfortunately, that's about where the good things I can say about this one ends. To be fair, this was made as an unlicensed title without an official software development kit. They try to incorporate the same control scheme with the jump, kick, and punch buttons, with jump being in the middle unless you reassign them. This works okay, but man, the controls sometimes work and sometimes don't. That's mainly because the enemy attacks you in very quick succession. Get 2 or 3 on screen and you might as well not even bother to press any buttons because their attacks take priority. Of course you can move around the screen, but the enemies follow you very closely. What the hell, am I magnetic? Also, when I advance, why do I need to be so damn close to the edge of the screen to make it scroll? You can walk right into a waiting enemy that you didn't see. And you really need to be careful around gaps like this. Oops. Also, in the final stage, aren't bricks supposed to be jutting out of this part to push me off? I'm guessing I just didn't get close enough to trigger them. Despite all this, you can just power your way through this game's 4 levels and beat it in no time. Lastly, the music sounds awful. Did they just take a MIDI file and assign random instruments and not listen to it to see how it sounds? Wow, it's super abrasive. Just like my personality. Now, there are fan patches that fix everything here from the music to the speed, but keep in mind we're sticking with retail releases in this episode. We all know that the Genesis can do much better than this. Double Dragon on the Sega Master System is a better game in most respects. It retains the 2-player action and has much better sounding music regardless of if you listen to it in the default PSG or the FM soundtrack. Yeah, everything is a lot smaller, but it's very colorful and it still looks fantastic for the system. And it's just a lot more fun, even with only 2 buttons. You have to press both buttons at the same time to jump, but it doesn't take long to get used to. Most of the moves are still here, but it can be tough to pull off with only 2 buttons, much less make contact with an enemy. The game loses all the bits where you can climb on a ladder. In fact, the game loses all of the verticality of the original. Except right here. Whoa! Oh, and right here. Whoa, man, how did they do that? That is a trip! It is a flickery mess, which is this one's biggest downfall, but overall, it's much more enjoyable than the Genesis game. And hell, even the NES version of Double Dragon is better than the Genesis version. This one right here was a mega hot game when it was released. Of course, when it came out, it was hard to get thanks to one of Nintendo's many chip shortages, which only made it more desirable. Nintendo knows that scarcity creates demand and headlines. Anyway, this version is single player, which sucks, but it still plays a great game of Double Dragon. Some might even argue that it's better than the Sega Master System version, and people who argue that do have a point. For example, this game adds a lot of extra areas and level extensions that are unique to this version. That's pretty cool, though some of these areas don't work well with the control because you can't move up or down, so you're stuck on a single plane. I still like these areas though. One thing you need to look out for are the looping levels. This level will repeat forever unless you know to go into one of the holes here. Same with this level. Don't fight these Abobos, instead climb up, because if you fight and defeat them, the game won't let you climb up afterwards for some reason. One thing that you may or may not like is that you have to earn your moves by defeating enemies. Once you murder enough enemies, you'll get a heart, and a new move becomes available that you can do. The graphics are muted, but still great for the time. The flicker is limited because only you and 2 enemies are allowed on screen at any given time. Even with that, this game is quite challenging. The enemy is very adept at avoiding your attacks. Unfortunately, this one sets you back a tiny bit if you die, and there are no continues, so good luck. Still, this game is great overall. And once again, I want to mention the Game Boy version real quick. This one takes the NES design and rethinks it. You no longer have to earn your moves. However, there are exclusive areas that will remind you of the NES game. And you'll likely have more fun playing this than the Genesis game. So the Master System, Game Boy, and the NES version here are all better than the 16-bit Genesis version. Lastly, we have Super Monkey Ball for the GameCube. This is one of my favorite games of all time, and definitely my favorite game for the console. Super Monkey Ball 2 is also fantastic, but not as good as Part 1. But I need to mention it in this section anyway. The object of the game is to guide your monkey to the goal. I don't mean to toot my own horn, maybe I do, but I'm really good at this game. I can't tell you how many hours I've put into this one over the years, and I never get sick of it. But then Super Monkey Ball Deluxe came out for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. This was released in 2005. The PlayStation 2 is weaker than the GameCube, so that version doesn't count for this episode. However, the Xbox is quite a bit more powerful. The disc has both Super Monkey Ball 1 and 2. Is this package better than the GameCube originals? Well, yes and no. The first game does now feature optional widescreen as well as 480p graphics, whereas the original didn't, and that's pretty cool. And there are also a lot of new stages that are unique to this version, at least they were for the time. Mostly, this is a fantastic disc with tons of content, at least on the Xbox. You don't want to play the PS2 version. However, there are some issues with the control. This boils down to two issues. One is that there's very little or no dead zone on the Xbox controller. The other is that the Xbox analog stick has much less swing than the GameCube analog stick. That makes the control here extremely sensitive. It's very tough to get past stages like this because the game's going to react to every little nuance and micro vibration. If blood just happens to pump through your thumb at the wrong time, well, off you go. It is still doable, but you really do need to make sure you're in a very zen-like state so that you don't accidentally overcorrect. Sega seems to have acknowledged this, at least in a few of the brand new stages. Like here, you kind of get locked on when trying to get on these thin tracks. I didn't do that, the game did that on its own. This is still an excellent title, but the GameCube controller just can't be beat. Go! Then, in 2021, Sega released Super Monkey Ball Banana Mania on all of the modern platforms of the time. And I have all of the console versions, that's what kind of Monkey Ball fan I am. I made an entire video about this one back then, but not a whole lot of you saw it, so I figured I'd remind everyone about this one. It upgrades both Super Monkey Ball 1 and 2 to 4K visuals and 16:9, which is of course to be expected. It really does look good, for Super Monkey Ball. It sounds pretty nice too, and if you spend extra money, you can get the original music if you prefer. Anyway, like Super Monkey Ball Deluxe, this one has control issues, but the controls here are considerably worse. A lot of this is due to how the camera now tracks your monkey. It's just not the same, and as a result, you can over or under correct your tilt. You do have control of the camera with the second analog stick, which is cool, but it's not always a blessing. If you move the camera while you're tilting the board, you're probably going to have a bad time. But as to be expected, it goes beyond the camera and into the controls themselves. Getting past this stage is nearly impossible for me on any version of this game. The controls are just way too sensitive. I always end up overcorrecting, and that results in my doom. Keep in mind that I'm really good at this game, I'm not just some random loser. Getting past it on the GameCube is easy peasy. Any underdeveloped fetus could do it. I really wish they would have tried their best to replicate the GameCube controls by at least having a small dead zone. Even using a real GameCube controller on the Switch version isn't helpful, so there must be some underlying issues with the way the controls were programmed here. Not only that, but they changed the actual physics. In the original game, you could hold forward and bounce right into the goal in this stage. Nice! You could even do this in Super Monkey Ball Deluxe. At least they kept the physics and the tricks that you could do the same in that. In Banana Mania here, your bounces have a different amount of effect applied, and you'll fall through the stage every time if you try that tactic. You might say that they did this to challenge expert players, but I don't believe that for a second. I mean, they made lots of other changes to make the game easier, like eliminating gaps in some stages. Like in this Anthropod stage, gaps aplenty in the original and also in Super Monkey Ball Deluxe. In Banana Mania here, you can see that they decreased the gap amount so that it requires no skill at all. So yeah, that argument just doesn't hold up. And they even ruined the mini-games. Monkey Target is the only one I care about, and it's damn hard to even make it anywhere to land. Like I said, they changed the physics. I don't know why, I wish they didn't. There was no reason for them to. No version of this game has a perfectly locked 60 frames per second at all times, but the PlayStation 5 version is by far the worst, with plenty of stuttering. But honestly, this game should be running at or close to 120 frames per second. It's not like there's a ton of geometry here. The PlayStation 4 version actually runs better than the PS5 version. Anyway, don't get me wrong, Banana Mania here is a good game, especially if you haven't played the originals. But if you want a real challenge with extremely precise and fair controls, you've got to play the original on the GameCube.
Ready?
And there you go, some examples of games that were better on lesser powered hardware. This one was really fun to make. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I do have a few other examples of games that meet this criteria that I wasn't able to fit in this episode, so maybe we'll come back to it. But how about you? Do you have any examples of games that are better on weaker powered consoles? If so, let me know. And in the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack.
Hi, how you doing? And welcome to the Joe Rutherford Show. Today's topic, people who look like me. Now let's bring out our first guest, Mr. Dwight Zimble. How you doing today, Joe? Just fine, Dwight. Now could you please tell us why you're here?
Well, Joe, as you can see, I have a severe problem. You see, I look like you.
And why do you consider this a problem?
Who wants to look like you?
Did you just come here to insult me? Is that what you're trying to do, is to insult me?
Seems to be very easy to do.
If that's your attitude, you can just get off my show now.
I'm not going anywhere.
Well, I'm just gonna have to kill you. This has been the Joe Rutherford Show. Thank you, and good night.